From the nation's capital, the Conservative Caucus presents Conservative Roundtable, an in-depth look at today's most important issues.
Welcome to Conservative Roundtable. I'm Howard Phillips, chairman of the Conservative Caucus, which sponsors this broadcast. I'm delighted that we have as our guest today a man whose name should be a household word throughout the country, but whose name I'm sure will be remembered by you after you meet him through this broadcast. It's Dr. Jerome Corsi of New Jersey. Dr. Corsi has played an important part in American history in recent years. He has a distinguished academic record. He wrote his first book when he was 16 years old. He has an advanced degree in political science from Harvard University and many other degrees as well. And during the presidential campaign of 2004, Dr. Corsi had a great deal to do with the publication of a book promulgated by an organization led by swift boat veterans of the Vietnam War. Jerry, would you tell us about that?
Yes, Howard, it's great to be with you.
Thank you.
With John O'Neill, my great friend, who is a swift boat veteran, we co-authored Unfit for Command, which was the book telling the swift boat's story, Swift Boat Veterans for the Truth, about John Kerry's record in Vietnam and his anti-war protests after. So it really was Swift Boat Veterans Speak Out Against John Kerry. That was the subtitle of the book and what the book was really about.
So many people had no memory of the part that Kerry played as head of a group called Vietnam Veterans Against the War in the early 1970s. I'm from Massachusetts, and I followed Kerry's career. In fact, in 1972, the fellow who was the best man at my wedding, Paul Cronin, defeated Kerry in a race for Congress in a district into which Kerry had recently moved. And during that campaign, as you well know, Jerry, Kerry's brother was arrested for burglarizing the headquarters of one of Kerry's Democratic primary opponents.
Yes, I remember that.
Yeah. That book, Unfit to Command, probably had as much to do with the victory of George Bush in 2004 as any other single factor.
Well, it's an interesting set of circumstances. John O'Neill and I knew each other in college. When John was at Annapolis, I was at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland. We were both debaters. We debated against each other, and we were quite good friends. John went to Vietnam. I had eczema, Howard. They wouldn't take me. They said my skin was not good enough to kill Viet Cong.
Quick story, quick interruption. A very dear friend of mine was Dr. Walter Judd.
Oh, yes.
Who had facial skin cancer.
Yes.
He gave the greatest speech I've ever heard in my life as the keynoter at the 1960 Republican National Convention. The speech was so well received that Richard Nixon invited Dr. Judd to his suite at the Sheraton Blackstone and said, "Congressman Judd, I'd like you to be my vice presidential running mate." And Judd said, "I'm sorry, because of my facial scars, I would be a detriment to your candidacy, so I must decline your offer."
Yes.
But he was a great man, and
well,
you're one to be emulated as well.
Well, thank you. What I did at that time, John O'Neill, of course, went off into the Swift Boat Command. John Kerry had just left. In fact, John O'Neill took the same boat that Kerry had commanded. And when I was at Harvard, I continued the work I was doing on anti-war protests, on political violence. I'd been writing about riots.
And at one point in your career, you gave anti-terrorism training to American government employees with AID stationed overseas.
That was 1981, 1982. I had continued working on terrorism. But in the 70s, I did a lot of studies. I worked at the Lundberg Center for the Study of Violence at Brandeis while I was at Harvard. And so I had studied and written about many of the demonstrations John Kerry was in. I've observed him for years. And in fact, Howard, I had a lot of the documents at that time that demonstrated and proved that John Kerry had met with Madame Bin, the chief negotiator of the Viet Cong in Paris, and I resolved to keep those documents. My wife today still says I wrote Unfit for Command out of the attic, because John Kerry had said in the 70s he was going to run for president. And I thought, well, if he did and I was still alive, we might just meet again or hook up again. And so I called John O'Neill. I hadn't spoken to John O'Neill in about 38 years. And we reconnected, and we began putting together Unfit for Command.
Well, we have the same rule in the Phillips family: never throw anything away.
Well, I've thrown lots away, but these papers I kept.
You never know when it'll come in handy.
That's right.
Well, you've manifested your expertise in a number of areas. One of the issues which is being debated all over the country is what ought be U.S. policy toward Iran. Last year, or in 2005, you published a book, Atomic Iran, How the Terrorist Regime Bought the Bomb and American Politicians. What brought you into that topic?
Well, it occurred at the end of the presidential campaign. John Kerry, in one of the debates with President Bush, had said that he would actually give the Iranians nuclear fuel to see what they did with it. And I thought at the time that that was a foolhardy approach, the same one we had used with North Korea under the Clinton administration. And it was clear what a regime like North Korea or Iran did. They made bombs. And I had been aware of that issue because going back to 1979, when I was doing work on anti-terrorism, it was over the hostage-taking in Tehran that I got my clearance with the State Department and helped train embassy personnel on hostage survival. So I've been working on Iran going back to 1979. When Kerry said this, it triggered in my mind again. I looked into it, and I began to become very concerned that Iran was now going to become a nuclear threat and the first Islamic nuclear terrorist state. And that really demanded that I write a book about it, that I get into the subject, which I did very deeply. And I've just finished a second book with Michael Evans. It's called Showdown with Nuclear Iran. It'll be out in October 2006. It'll be out just in a few weeks. And it will be, I think, a second version of the story. I'm very pleased with Atomic Iran. The Showdown with Nuclear Iran talks about Ahmadinejad, the current ruler, and this whole idea that there will be an Islamic Messiah, the Mahdi, this guided one that went down a well in 941 AD, and Ahmadinejad and the Shiite group that he belongs to believes that the Mahdi will come out of that well with an apocalypse happening first, and then Islam will triumph worldwide. And so for a state that's building nuclear weapons, for the head of the state to have this belief of a messianic Islamic figure that will come forth from the well after an apocalypse happens, it's very dangerous.
You have a great deal of experience writing books. You wrote your first book when you were 16 years old.
Yes.
How did that come about?
Well, the book was the pros and cons of collective bargaining versus compulsory arbitration. My dad was a executive in the labor unions for the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen, and he helped to create the United Transportation Union. And he knew that I could write, so he'd been enlisting me to write since
How did you learn how to write?
Well, he was a writer, and I started that way. I think I must have had a talent for it. I went to a Jesuit high school, St. Ignatius in Cleveland. They were very good teachers, of course, taking Latin and Greek, which I did. Ancient Latin and Greek helped with grammar and structure. I think, Howard, I always had an inclination to it and a gift for it.
I encourage everyone viewing this broadcast to take up the study of Latin and Greek and to encourage their children to do the same. I had the same opportunity at Boston Latin School. I took 6 years of Latin. I took 2 years of Greek, and it's been of incalculable value to me as a writer, as a speaker, as someone who is able to discern clues about what's happening in the world using these two important languages, which are the foundation of our culture in so many ways.
I agree. I mean, I went through a classical honors program at St. Ignatius, and it was the best training it could possibly have had. It has continued to be invaluable. I think about it. It structured my thinking and taught me how to write and how to make arguments, make distinctions, etc. It was invaluable.
Well, your writing was so good that they paid you to go to Harvard. They not only gave you a full scholarship, they paid you to come.
Well,
Tell us about that.
Well, I had written 2 books as an undergraduate, and when I applied to Harvard, they were both very well known at the time and had been working on political violence and terrorism, race riots. So they offered me a National Science Foundation fellowship. It paid all my expenses at Harvard, all tuition, and gave me a living stipend, which was about $1,000 a month in 1968, which was a lot of money in those days. And I got accepted into the law school at the same time, but they did not yet have a joint program. And the law school wasn't paying anything for me to go to the law school, so I decided I'd go to the graduate school and get a PhD.
Follow the money. Please stay with us. We're taking a break now, and after the break we'll come back and we'll be learning a lot more about Dr. Jerome Corsi's well-informed insights about many of the things happening in the world today. Please stay with us. The Constitution of the United States is a guarantor of our liberties if it is followed. Unfortunately, too many of our elected officials neither read the Constitution nor adhere to its provisions. The Conservative Caucus has as its mission limiting the federal government to its delegated, enumerated functions. We strive to reassert the principles of sovereignty and accountability set forth in the Declaration of Independence and confirmed in the United States Constitution. The Conservative Caucus deserves your support as the only national conservative organization for which constitutional fidelity is a prime issue and motivating force.
The Conservative Caucus, www.conservativeusa.org or 703-938-9626.
Here's how you can become a citizen lobbyist and influence how your representatives vote. Write a letter to your congressmen and senators. Speak out on a call-in talk radio program. Write a letter to the editor of your local newspaper and call the Conservative Caucus for more information at 703-938-9626.
More than the entire population of Cincinnati. More than all the men and women in the Marine Corps. More than 4 times the number of unemployed auto workers. Since 1980, over 500,000 Americans who make clothing and home fashions have lost their jobs because we don't realize the impact of buying imported goods. So if you think looking for the Made in the USA label doesn't matter,
next,
it matters.
Find curious facts from America's past at loc.gov, the Library of Congress website.
Welcome back. I'm Howard Phillips, chairman of the Conservative Caucus, which sponsors Conservative Roundtable. And our guest for this edition of Conservative Roundtable, the first of 2 featuring him, is Dr. Jerome Corsi, the author of many books, an expert on many subjects. And let me talk about a couple of, or let you talk about a couple of other books you've written. One is called Gold Stranglehold, The Myth of Scarcity and the Politics of Oil. Talk about that.
Yes, I wrote that with Craig Smith of Swiss America, who's a good friend. Since I was a child, Howard, it's always occurred to me that oil was not a biological product. As a child, it was supposed to be from dinosaurs and ancient forests. Well, none of that ever convinced me. I remember reading, even in the 50s, when I was 8 or 9 years old, that the Soviets had found oil deep within the earth, several thousand kilometers below the surface of the earth. And it occurred to me that that could not have come from biological deterioration. And as I studied it over the years, I never thought for sure I'd get a chance to write a book on it. But I studied the various abiotic theories, which oil is a natural product which continuously creates. And we decided to write this book to get that theory out because the peak oil theory has been dominating. If there are only so many fossils, there can only be so much oil, so we're going to run out inevitably. It's kind of an inherent idea in the theory.
And that is nonsense.
It's nonsense. It's all totally nonsense. And to just shortcut it, I try to give people these examples. I say at the end of the Mesozoic era, it's not true that all the dinosaurs herded to Saudi Arabia and died in a pile, and that's why we have oil in Saudi Arabia. It just didn't happen that way. Saudi Arabia has deep fissures in the bedrock, and they lie over where the oil fields are. which is consistent with the abiotic theory. I also tell people, you know, I had a dead cat when I was a kid, like almost every boy did, and you bury it in the backyard. When you dig it up a little bit later, there was no oil. And I suspected if I had a pile of cats and buried them very deep, there still wouldn't have been any oil, because the natural tendency of biological tissue is to deteriorate into constituent chemicals, not to advance into a higher form of hydrocarbons, which is what oil is. And since the book has been published, a lot of validation has come in. NASA had a probe on Titan, the great moon of Saturn, and it's filled with methane. It's carbon-13, which is abiotic, and NASA declared that it was abiotic. Of course, their alternative was to say there were a lot of little dinosaurs or plankton on Titan that created the oil. And we've also been finding oil very deep. There's been a recent finding in the Gulf, which is probably going to increase by 50%. The Jack Field, by 50% the U.S. reserves that are known today.
And it helps Chevron on the stock market.
Helps Chevron tremendously. And I think probably you're going to find the Gulf of Mexico is full of oil.
Isn't it tragic that we gave Cuba the authority to drill there and denied it to ourselves, and now Cuba is in partnership with Chinese communists exploiting those oil resources?
Oh, yes. Well, we thank Jimmy Carter for that, of course, along with giving the Panama Canal back to Panama. We'll probably talk about this later. I'm involved with this in my current work. But I was going to say there was a great comet that did hit the Yucatan at the end of the Mesozoic era, and it probably deeply fractured the entire bed of the Gulf. Last, Howard, on this, we'll never run out of oil. We have more proven reserves now than ever in human history. And we've only looked for oil really on land, and a very small portion of that. 70% of the earth is covered by water. There's no reason to think there isn't oil.
And by the way, this is another reason why we must stand against the United Nations Law of the Sea Treaty, which would give control of the oil at sea to the Marxist majority at the United Nations.
Exactly. There's probably a huge amount of oil yet to be found within the earth, probably unestimable how much there is. And Black Gold Stranglehold looked at the resource economics, looked at the scares, and it's actually been gaining since I wrote it. I'll probably write another book on that subject to try to get that point driven home.
And earlier this year, together with Ken Blackwell, who's running for governor of Ohio, as we tape this broadcast, you wrote a book called Rebuilding America, a prescription for creating strong families, building the wealth of working people, and ending welfare. Tell us about that.
Well, this took me back to some of the very first research I did when I was in college. I'd written the book then called A Time to Burn about the race riots, and I'd examined all of the scientific literature at the time, and we went back essentially to argue that the problem with the welfare program is that it creates dependency. It destroys family structures. And with that dependency, you lose the ability to advance beyond welfare. And so what we argued was to basically create jobs, to have the state here in Ohio focus on putting money through the banks into job creation, not to do it as a government program, because the government programs end up being wasteful. They end up funding the wrong things. If the banks are involved in putting their own money in as well, you will get productive businesses formed that will be economically viable and can create jobs. Without jobs, you won't advance out of poverty. The statistics in the African American community are shocking, with some 70 or 80% of all children today born out of wedlock, largely to teenage mothers. That's a definite formula for disaster. It won't advance without breaking those cycles of dependency and reestablishing families.
Let me say, Jerry, I've spent a lot of time in the African American community in Boston. In 1965, I managed the campaign of a black conservative running for the state senate in an area in which 1/3 plus of the population was African American. And at that time, you still had fairly strong black families. You still had, even though there was a lot of the matriarchal tendency, and there was not the kind of leadership in all cases that one would hope for from black males. Nonetheless, it was a very different situation than that which prevailed after the Great Society came in and undercut the work ethic, undercut the black community.
You're right. And we went back to, in this book with Ken Blackwell, to the Moynihan Report, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who in the 60s came under great criticism, but he articulated this and showed the dynamic very clearly. The AFDC, the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, paid women to break up their families and to have no husbands. And that was the beginning of the welfare dependency. Moynihan was right.
Yep. Jerry, we have to take another break. We'll have a couple of minutes when we come back, and I'd like to use that time to talk about your most recent book, which focuses on a topic that's on everyone's mind, immigration. And the name of that book is Minutemen, The Battle to Secure America's Borders. It's important that you hear this, so stay with us. We'll be right back after these next messages. There are many conservative organizations, but the Conservative Caucus is unique in that our standard for evaluating public policy is the Constitution of the United States. Our goal is to advocate policies which conform to what the Constitution stipulates and to oppose those which undermine the Constitution. It's clear that the federal government has only those powers which are provided in the Constitution, which were initially delegated by the states to the federal government or which were subsequently added by amendment. If we adhered to that principle, your taxes would be lower and your liberties would be more secure.
The Conservative Caucus, www.conservativeusa.org or 703-938-9626.
Here's how you can become a citizen lobbyist and influence how your representatives vote. Write a letter to your congressmen and senators. Speak out on a call-in talk radio program. Write a letter to the editor of your local newspaper, and call the Conservative Caucus for more information at 703-938-9626.
Welcome back. I'm Howard Phillips, chairman of the Conservative Caucus, which sponsors Conservative Roundtable. If you're interested in the kinds of issues we discuss on Conservative Roundtable, please check out our website, www.conservativeusa.org. Or if you have a question or want more information, you can fax us at 703-281-4108, or you can use snail mail and mail to us at 450 Maple Avenue East, Vienna, V-I-E-N-N-A, Virginia, 22180. And by the way, I have a blog that's published a few times every week called howardphillips.com. You might want to check that out. It gives me a chance to offer commentary on the events of the day. You can also contact our distinguished guest, Dr. Jerome Corsi, by checking out his website, which is
MinutemanProject.com.
MinutemanProject.com. Well, Jerry, we've talked about several of your books. You're a very prolific writer, and all of your books are great. Tell us about your most recent book, Minutemen, The Battle to Secure America's Borders, which you've done with Jim Gilchrist, who was a Constitution Party candidate for Congress in California this last year. And he actually got more votes than any other candidate, but for the fact that enough absentee ballots were piled up that the winner defeated him by virtue of those absentee ballots. But he got a tremendous show of support.
Yes, Jim Gilchrist and I teamed up. He is the founder of the Minuteman Project, and we began to work on this book. It follows through on my continuing concern about terrorism, because we knew that there are terrorists coming across our border with Mexico. We have definitive proof of that. I mean, a group of Hezbollah terrorists that bribed consular officials, Mexican consular officials in Beirut, came through Mexico and set up shop in Dearborn, Michigan. They were sending money back to Hezbollah terrorists in Lebanon, and they're in federal prison. So there's definitive proof that terrorists have come across our border with Mexico. And I could not understand why President Bush would not secure the border, knowing this. I began working, I contacted Jim Gilchrist. We decided to work together. And this book really examines the threat that an open border leaves. I mean, the number of terrorists, criminals, MS-13 gang, the tattooed El Salvadorian gang. When we did the book, the FBI told us, and we quote, MS-13 is in 3,000 American communities now, all across the United States.
There have been some outrageous crimes committed in our vicinity in Virginia of women being gang raped, people being macheted and slaughtered, etc. Jerry, I'm going to have to cut you off there because even though we have a lot more to say,
Yes.
Our time is running out. We have about 10 seconds left. All I can say is I encourage you to check out MinutemanProject.com. I encourage you to check out on Amazon or elsewhere the various books written by Dr. Jerome, Jerome Corsi, capital C-O-R-S-I. And remember, this is part one of a two-part interview with Dr. Corsi. You won't want to miss our next interview, which talks about the shadow government George Bush is creating to move us into a North American union in which America loses its liberty and independence. Be sure to watch us in next week's broadcast. Jerry Corsi, thank you so much.
Thank you, Howard. Great pleasure to be with you.
We appreciate it very much.